The standard treatment for thyroid issues of giving thyroid medication or iodine may be one of the worst things that you can do for your thyroid issue. Stay tuned and find out why. Hey, I'm Dr. Sten Ekberg with Wellness for Life, and by subscribing to our channel, you will learn everything that you need to know to master true health. Thyroid is one of the most important organs in the body and one of the most easily missed and one of the most misunderstood. Why is it so important? Well, the thyroid is like a thermostat. Think of it as the accelerator for your metabolism. You have about 100 trillion cells in your body, and every one of those cells have thyroid hormone receptors. That means the thyroid dictates how quickly every cell in your body does what it does. So when the thyroid slows down, everything in your body slows down. Let's look at the symptoms. If you have a thyroid problem, it usually means that you're hypothyroid. Hypo means underperforming, that the thyroid isn't doing enough. And as a result, if the thyroid slows down, everything in your body slows down. So you're going to see symptoms like slowed digestion, poor digestion, because your thyroid's involved with making hydrochloric acid to break down proteins. You will see weight gain, you will see fatigue, you see coarse, brittle hair, you see swelling and edema. Even though these symptoms affect women mostly, we find that people without symptoms also have the problem of hypothyroid. And in our clinic, we see this is equally rampant among men. So these symptoms affect a tremendous number of people. Do you even know someone who doesn't have one or more of these? If you do, or someone you know, it may be related to a hypothyroid. So give us some feedback, write down your experience, and let's see if we can clear that up for you. So the other type of thyroid problem is hyperthyroid. Hyper means it is revving too fast, it's doing too much. So now all the cells of the body are accelerated. So now you have things like anxiety and racing heart and excessive bowel movements, excessive sweating, trouble sleeping, and on and on and on. A typical medical sign is that you have bulging eyes. Very often these people also have unexplained rapid weight loss. No matter how much they eat, they have ravenous appetite, but they can't put any weight on. That could also be hyperthyroid. So again, if you have any questions or you know someone like that, don't hesitate to put down your questions and comments down below in the comments section, and we'll try to address those for you. It is also possible to alternate between hyper and hypo, especially if your thyroid is under autoimmune attack called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So then, while the thyroid cells are sluggish, your thyroid slows down, and then when some of those cells die from the attack, now they spill their contents, which is thyroid hormone, and now you get a burst of thyroid hormone. So now you're hyper for a while until that kind of wears off and the thyroid is sluggish again. So especially in the early stages, you can see that. We'll talk a little bit more about Hashimoto's later in the presentation. One of the most important things to understand is that the thyroid does not operate in isolation. It is part of a bigger machinery. And when we talk about thyroid function, we're not only talking about the thyroid tissue and its ability to produce hormones. We're talking about all the players, all the systems that are involved with producing and stimulating and modifying and getting that thyroid hormone out to the target tissue, which is all the cells that are going to use it. Anything that is not working out of all those pieces is going to create hypo or hyperthyroid, typically hypothyroid. So some of the key players are hypothalamus. It is the master regulator of your hormones. It controls the pituitary, which is the master gland. It manufactures most of the hormones and distributes, secretes most of those hormones. Then we have the thyroid, who makes the thyroid hormone, and we have the liver and we have the gut. So let's look at what each of those does in a little bit more detail. So the whole process starts with the hypothalamus. Again, it is the master regulator of your hormone. It sits deep inside the head right about here. And right below it is the pituitary, and they're only about a half an inch apart. So the hypothalamus asks, do we have enough thyroid hormone? And if the answer is no, it sends out a messenger called TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone, and it basically says to the pituitary, go tell the thyroid to make some more hormone. So the pituitary does what it's told, and it relays the message, and it sends out a message called TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and it is received by the thyroid that looks like a little butterfly and sits right under your Adam's apple. And TSH tells the thyroid that it's time to go to work. We don't have enough thyroid hormone. Better make some. And now the thyroid says, okay, I get the message. Let me make some thyroid hormone. And it makes two types of thyroid hormone. It makes one called T4 and one called T3. And even though T3 is the more active one, it makes mostly T4, and then it puts this out into circulation, and it leaves the liver to activate it. So the liver gets to determine how much activation is going on, and the liver sits right about here. Now the liver gets the T4, which is named that way because it has 4 iodine molecules on it. And through an enzymatic process, it takes away 1 and now leaves 3, so it's called T3. But not all of this T3 turns out perfect. About 60% of it becomes active, perfect T3. 20% of it becomes reverse T3, and that's basically backwards. It's good for nothing, and the body is just going to get rid of it. But the interesting part is the last 20%, which is an inactive form of T3 that can potentially be activated, and it is sent to the gut. So this can be a bit of a problem now, because the last 20% of thyroid activity depends on how healthy the gut is. And very few people have a healthy gut. This thyroid hormone can be activated by healthy gut bacteria. But after all of the antibiotics and all the processed foods and all the sugars and all the chemicals, very, very few people have a good, healthy flora that is capable of activating this hormone. So as much as 20% can be lost and not available to the tissues. On the other hand, if we have a supremely healthy gut, now all of a sudden 20% more of activated T3 can be available to the tissues. So now we need to finish the cycle and see if it all worked. So the hypothalamus sent out a message, and now it wants to see if it worked. So it monitors again, and it checks how much T4 is available now. And if there is enough T4 available, then it backs off. It orders less because there is enough. This is called negative feedback. So if there's more available of the end product, it's going to turn off the thing that initiated the process. And by reverse, if we still don't have enough thyroid hormone, then the hypothalamus is going to ask again. It's going to raise its voice and demand louder and more. So now those order hormones, the TRH and the TSH, is going to go up, and now we have what's called hypothyroid. Now, how do they deal with this in standard care, and how has this been dealt with in the last few decades? And why are so many people feeling bad and experiencing so many of these symptoms, even though their blood work says that they're perfectly normal? Well, the first thing is that typically the only thing that they measure routinely is TSH. And TSH isn't even a thyroid hormone, it's a pituitary hormone. It only measures how many orders were placed. It says nothing about any of the other factors that we went over. The other problem is that the range that they're looking at is humongous. Typically, the range goes from 0.5 to 5.0. So you could be anywhere in that range, and you could have a 0.5, or it could increase tenfold, 10 times more, and you're still just normal. It's as if nothing had changed. Well, obviously, there's a huge difference. There's an enormous range of varying activity within that range. So the problem is that they only measure TSH, and then they assume that if TSH is high, then it must be because the thyroid isn't doing its job. So they supplement you with synthetic T4 called Synthroid, and it has a bunch of different names on the market, but it's the synthetic thyroid hormone. And now this thyroid hormone, the synthetic hormone, convinces the hypothalamus that there is enough thyroid hormone around, so the TSH comes down and looks good on the blood work. And for some people, this works relatively well, at least for a while. For others, it doesn't work at all, and that's because it's something else that is causing it. But if we only measure TSH, then we're missing the real problem. One of the most common things would be that the liver is not converting the T4 to T3. So we have all this T4 floating around, but we have no converted active T3, or very little active T3 available for the target tissues. So now you're functionally hypothyroid. The cells aren't getting what they need, even though the blood work says that there's plenty of T4 and the TSH looks normal. So in those cases, sometimes they try what's called a natural thyroid hormone, or armor thyroid, that has a mix of T4 and T3, and this works for some people. So now there's a little bit larger percentage of people who see some symptom improvement. However, the single biggest problem with hypothyroid is that as much as 90% of it today is autoimmune. Except they don't test for it for two reasons. They don't know what to do about it, and if they found it, it wouldn't change anything that they do. They would still just supplement thyroid hormones. So Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an autoimmune disease. The thyroid is being attacked for some reason. The thyroid is extremely sensitive tissue. It is very sensitive to heavy metals and to chemicals, especially the ones that mimic hormones. They're called endocrine disruptors, and they could be anything from hormones in food to plastics or pesticides or chemicals that in any way look like a hormone, and there's thousands and thousands of those around. And if it is autoimmune, if it is Hashimoto's, then we know today that virtually all autoimmune disease starts with an unhealthy gut. It starts with unhealthy gut bacteria, antibiotics, leaky gut, allergies, inflammation, and so on. So that is the thing that we have to fix. And the problem with just giving people synthetic thyroid hormone is that the immune situation continues to deteriorate, and even though the blood work looks good, people are getting worse and worse and worse, and they're setting themselves up for further autoimmune attack. And that's something that we really want to avoid. One more factor with Hashimoto's is that now we're kind of playing by different rules. And a lot of people are making this mistake because Hashimoto's is so common that if we get a natural thyroid hormone, which is supposedly better, it could actually trigger further immune responses, further autoimmune attacks. And the same thing can happen for the most common supplement that people take for thyroid, namely iodine. Iodine can stimulate things in the thyroid that is more than the thyroid can handle at the time, but it can also further aggravate that immune attack. So we have to be really careful. We have to know what we're dealing with so that we can do the right thing for the thyroid. And there's one more thing that we want to understand, that we could actually have a hypothyroid with a high TSH, or we could have a hypothyroid with a low TSH. And here is the mechanism. If the thyroid is sluggish, then the hypothalamus and the pituitary is supposed to order more, so TSH goes up. That's the classic hypothyroid. But what if we have a lot of stress, we have a lot of cortisol in the system? Do you know anyone like that? Now that cortisol is actually going to shut down the production and the release of TRH and TSH. So now, even though we don't have enough thyroid hormone, the brain has a little bit of an inflammation, so it's not capable of placing the order. So now TSH goes down even though our thyroid hormone levels are down. And this we're seeing more and more and more. This is a TSH that falls just a little bit on the low side. It's not crazy low, but it is outside the sweet spot of 1.8 to 3.0. So the optimal range that we're looking for is 1.8 to 3.0. Right in the middle is the sweet spot, 2.5. They've developed some new guidelines because they realized that 5 is a really high value and you got problems long before that. So they lowered the upper level to 3, but they still think it's sort of like cholesterol. They still think that if high is bad, then the lower the better, right? Well, in this case, that's not true. So anything below 1.8 also indicates hypothyroid, but now it's probably stress and inflammation and cortisol mediated. Good to know. Let me quickly review that whole cycle again. We have to have proper function from the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the liver, the gut, and we have to have a proper feedback system. We have to keep inflammation and cortisol low. Can you see why it's not all about the thyroid? Can you see why it's not as simple as simply putting in some synthetic hormone until the blood values look good again? Exactly. Now, believe it or not, but this is the really simple version. There is something called a Harrower Shart, and this was published already in 1932. We knew all this stuff almost 100 years ago. And if you look at this chart, you see how incredibly complex the human endocrine or the hormone system is. Almost everything affects everything else. So do you think it's even possible to throw something into the system and think that you're not going to upset the balance of something else? That is what happens. Nature has taken millions and millions and millions of years with innate intelligence to perfectly balance and fine-tune this system. That's why we can't just throw things in there. We have to help the body reestablish the balance by addressing the thing that is not working. We have to start addressing the cause. So it turns out that the thyroid is almost never the primary problem. It is almost always something else affecting or stressing or attacking the thyroid. The only time that it is primary is if you're truly missing iodine. If you live someplace where the soil doesn't provide iodine, then you could be deficient. Your thyroid doesn't have the raw materials to make the hormone, and it tries to compensate. It starts growing to have more cells to do the best they can with what little iodine is available. Again, nature is incredibly intelligent. It's the exact appropriate response when you're missing iodine. But that's about the only time that the thyroid would be the primary problem. And then it's super easy to solve because you just take some iodine and that's it. Every other case, whether it's autoimmune or whether it's thyroid cancer or there's a nodule that's overproducing or something that's keeping it from producing, every other case there's something else that is affecting it, and in every other case we need to address and solve that other thing before we can fully restore health. That is why so many people are feeling bad, because they're not getting the true cause of the problem addressed. They're just supplementing with the thyroid hormone, and they're upsetting some other balance while they're ignoring the real problem, and the body can't heal properly. So remember that health is not merely the absence of disease, but it is the optimal function and optimal well-being of this individual and all of the systems. So when we have health, we have energy and focus. We can do all the things that we do, and we enjoy life. So if you enjoyed this, please subscribe. Let us know if you have comments or questions down below. We will do our very best to address them, and make sure that you hit that bell so you can keep getting this important information. Thank you.